And our conversation this morning with Saul Austerlitz, the author of Kind of a Big Deal, is brought to you by Marcus & Mack, voted best personal injury law firm in the Best of Indiana County contest. Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people, and the subtitle to the book is How Anchorman Stayed Classy and Became the Most Iconic Comedy of the 21st Century. And Saul is on the line with us this morning. Saul, this is so much fun. My goodness gracious.
Thanks.
How did you get through writing this book without just melting into laughter time and time again?
I definitely did. So I did not avoid that pitfall. It was definitely a blast to get to rewatch the movie so many times and look at individual scenes in detail. And I'm a lucky guy that's what work consisted of for a little while.
But what made you want to do that?
Well, I teach a class at NYU about the history of comedy, and the first week I show students Anchorman, in part as a bit of a provocation to say that even this movie that you may think of as being sort of hilarious but disposable, there's so much more to say about it. There are so many interesting themes that can be pulled out about the 1970s, about television news, about feminism. And, I'm cheating a little bit because I selected the film, but I want students to think some about the ways in which we sometimes dismiss comedy or treat it as disposable when, in fact, there's so much more to say about it. And so I taught this class for years, and it took me, 6 or 7 years of teaching this course to realize, hey, I want to write about this. I have a lot to say about this movie, and that's really how I got started.
And Anchorman turns out to be the perfect vehicle for that, because we might think of it as it's said a couple of times in the context of the book, that Anchorman, it's just an extended SNL skit, but it's so much more than that, and it proves your point, just what you were saying. And as we look at how it came to be, there are two guys, of course, who come up as the keys to this, and those are the two writers, Will Ferrell and help me, is it Bill McKay? Dave McKay? Adam McKay. I knew there was a name in there somewhere. But to me, the whole hero of the movie ends up being a fellow by the name of Brent White, who nobody's ever heard of.
Exactly. Yeah, it was really interesting to me to get to tell Brent White's story. He's the editor on the film, and I think it's helpful to think about, Anchorman was a movie that invested in a tremendous amount of improvisation and offered the actors the chance to try out different lines and to just play around with the material in a way that movies don't usually do because it's too time-consuming or too expensive. And so Brent White was the person who had to take this, these hundreds of thousands of feet of material and figure out how to make a story from it. And there are all sorts of stops and starts. The early versions of the film include an entire plot line about a, sort of vaguely radical group called the Alarm Clock and Ron Burgundy's attempts to take them down. And all of that ends up getting excised from the film. But Brent White's story is fascinating just in terms of the challenge of looking at all of this comic material and not only figuring out which parts are the funniest, but also how to tell a story with them.
Yeah, his genius really shows through in this. And this really was his first big-time job in a movie, wasn't it?
Yeah, and since then he's gone on to work on many of the classic comedies of the last 20 years or so.
It's really interesting how you write it and how we get to learn how it is that he came to be such a big key part of this movie. And it really comes down to one line, you killed the dog.
That's right. So, an early screening of the film, everyone attended and the audience was rolling in the aisles. Adam McKay felt like, okay, this is clearly a giant success. And then the cards came in with, the audience's written responses, and the numbers were way, way lower than what they had anticipated. And he couldn't understand it. They couldn't figure out what was going on. And then one of the executives said to him, essentially, you idiot, you killed the dog. And they realized that Baxter, Will Ferrell's character, Ron Burgundy's dog, had been killed off in this earlier version, and that audiences were possibly turned off by that. And in part through some of the changes they made to the end of the film, but also by not killing off Baxter, the later test screenings went much, much better.
And Baxter becomes a key part of the whole movie, as he should be. But let's get back to the very beginning of this movie, because like many, we hear these stories. The movie almost didn't get made. It went through a lot of different iterations, and there were different factors that went into the writing of it. But McKay and Will Ferrell sit down to write themselves a movie, and that's basically what they did. They just decided, hey, let's write a movie. And this is what they came up with. It was really their second effort, though, wasn't it?
Yeah. So they had met at Saturday Night Live, where Adam McKay became the head writer, and Will Ferrell was the breakout performer of the mid-'90s cast. And they realized they liked working together and decided to try their hand at writing a script together. And the first script they wrote was called August Blowout, and it was about used car dealers in Anaheim, California, home of Disneyland. And it was a very funny script and full of great material. And they shopped it around, got a lot of good feedback, but ultimately no one was willing to give them a green light to do it. And they felt very disappointed that they had put in all of this effort and all of this time and hadn't quite made it happen, but decided to start over again and started thinking about ideas for a new script. And one night, Will Ferrell was watching cable and was watching an A&E biography episode about the 1970s news pioneer Jessica Savitch, and was listening to one of Savage's fellow anchors, Mort Krim, talking on the episode and sort of saying offhandedly that, he and many of the other men in the field at the time had been, male chauvinist pigs. And something in Ferrell's mind just sparked, and he called McKay and told him to turn on the episode. And they started thinking about, this sort of bygone era of TV newscasters. But the early versions of Anchorman are quite different. They started off as a movie about a convention of newscasters flying to Philadelphia and crashing. The plane crashes en route, and it ends up being a story about cannibalism and animals wielding nunchucks and all sorts of other things that we don't actually see in the later versions of the movie. So they initially shopped this version around. We're told that it was wonderful, but also that there needed to be a bit more characterization, a bit more humanity to it. Judd Apatow was brought in as a kind of screenwriting mentor for them to help them polish it. And what he did, which was fascinating, is on the one hand, he helped them kind of concentrate on the characters and the relationship between the characters. But in other ways, he also encouraged them to really go big with the comedy. They had a scene, a sort of brief sketch of a sequence where, the Anchorman meet and have a kind of West Side Story style fight. And he told them, if you want to do this, let's do this. Write out the whole scene. Let's really picture what it's going to look like and what it's going to sound like. And so, Apatow's assistance is really crucial here. But the thing that really ultimately puts them over the top, they shop it around again. Again, there are a lot of very positive rejections, but nobody really seems to want to make it. Mm-hmm. And the thing that ultimately helps them move forward is that Old School comes out and is a surprise big hit. And people in the industry realize that Will Ferrell is a movie star now and want to find his next project. And so Anchorman is lined up perfectly there to play that role.
The battle that you mentioned, the street brawl, is just an amazing piece of cinema. It's something that I don't think I've ever seen before. I don't think very many people have ever seen anything like that before. And some of it today doesn't wear as well. But my goodness gracious, what a great comedic scene that is, and very, very complex. The way you describe the filming of it is just an incredible piece of writing by you. It's really, really an intricate process.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it was fascinating to learn more about how that played out. They did not have a lot of time to shoot this scene, so it essentially had to all be done in a single day. And it's obviously very different from most of the rest of the film I compare it to an action film breaking out in the middle of a comedy, and it really required a whole different set of skills. So Adam McKay told the crew that the one thing he really wanted to have for the sequence was that there had to be a man on fire just kind of walking through the scene. And that kind of set the tone for the kind of level of difficulty that the crew had for this. And I think one of the funnier things that happened as a result was at the end of the day, they had something like 80 or 90 shots that had to be made in one day. They had 3 different crews working simultaneously. It was a tremendously intricate scene, and it essentially, it had been pulled off. And then McKay and Farrell, as a joke, or what they thought was a joke, went to the crew the next day and said, essentially chewed them out and said, everyone's level of effort is unacceptable and we all need to work harder, and that was just no good. And rather than bursting out laughing like they had expected, the crew sort of looks at them blank-faced. And they realized that was, in that moment, they realized that's what many directors actually sound like. And so McKay had to spend the rest of the day going around individually to crew members and apologizing and saying, we thought it was a joke. You guys are doing an amazing job. Obviously, we feel like you went over the top and did incredible work. And I think that's telling in terms of the contrast between the kind of set that McKay and Farrell established and the kinds of experiences that the crew had elsewhere.
It was really a different kind of movie making, and probably a lot of it has to do with the lack of experience at directing movies from Adam McKay. But it's really a fascinating way that it all unfolds. You mentioned earlier as well, Saul, that there are some very dark themes that are underneath the surface of this movie, and some of those are really things that wouldn't play well if this movie were to come out today. But they are serious themes, and while we're laughing at this movie, maybe we're thinking about them in a different way as well.
Yeah, I think that it's notable to look at the film as a kind of expression of Ron Burgundy as a sort of struggling misogynist, right? As somebody who is so angry at the notion that a woman might step into his field, might potentially, challenge his dominance as, the most important newscaster in the second largest city in Southern California. And I think what's fascinating is to see the ways in which the movie is really intent on giving us this portrait of kind of really ugly behavior, a really ugly response, and also putting it very much in the context of the past, right? I think it's really important here that the movie is made in 2004, but set in the 1970s, so that it gives us a sense that these are the things that happened in the bad old days, right? It allows us to maintain some distance from the kinds of behavior that we're seeing, that we can chuckle at it, but also 2 things are happening. One is that Veronica Corningstone, the character played by Christina Applegate, ends up winning all of the battles, right? She wins the physical battles, but she also wins the kinds of, wars of words that the characters end up happening. And I think also putting it in the context of the past allows audiences to enjoy this sort of behavior, because it's understood to be something that is no longer acceptable.
You spend a great deal of time as well exploring the relationship between Ron and Champ, and we don't have time to get into it today, but it's well worth the read just for that as well. The book itself is called Kind of a Big Deal: How Anchorman Stayed Classy and Became the Most Iconic Comedy of the 21st Century. We didn't even get into Steve Carell here, and what an amazing performer he is. But that's a whole other interview. Saul Austerlitz, thank you so much for visiting with us this morning. Where are we going to learn more about you and about your book?
Well, you can visit my website, www.saulausterlitz.com.
Beautiful. Hey, I appreciate the time. Have a wonderful day today.
Thanks so much.